Japanese cars are made better. And it was not just with Japanese auto manufacturing, it was with electronics. If you had a electronic item made in Japan, a television set made in Japan, if you had a, at the time, VCR made in Japan, if you had a stereo system made in Japan, in the 1980s, the belief was that Japanese products were better quality than American-made products. So in the 1980s, American manufacturers started to say, okay, we need to learn from the Japanese. It is no longer just a question of they have lower wages, they have more modern factories. It's not just the technology which is different, but the management system. So in the 1980s, American manufacturers wanted to learn from the Japanese. What is total quality management? How can American manufacturers implement total quality management? Now, those of you who have studied business and management, those of you who are in MBA programs, you've probably heard of TQM, but for those of you who are not familiar, a brief history and review. The idea of total quality management is 100% quality, 0% defect. And this is what some people call zero tolerance. You do not tolerate any defects. Some individuals refer to this as Six Sigma manufacturing. And the idea of Six Sigma manufacturing is to reduce the defect rate so you have very few defects per million units produced. So you try to aim for something where you have 100% quality, 0% defects, maybe perhaps 6 defects out of a million. That is the goal of total quality management. Now, ironically, the Japanese did not invent total quality management. And even though the Americans wanted to learn total quality management from Japan, it was really interesting and ironic because the idea of TQM came from the United States. In the 1940s, there was a PhD professor of statistics, operations management, and his name was Dr. Deming. And Dr. Deming was a professor at MIT, and he'd come up with this idea called statistical process control, random sampling. By taking random samples, you could observe the output, you could detect if there's some trend towards defects, you could correct problems before it's too late, you could stop the production line before you have too much in the way of negative output or defective output. Dr. Deming went to the American companies in the 1940s, 1950s and said, I have this idea to improve quality. I have this idea to reduce defects in your production. And Dr. Deming went to American companies in the 1940s, 50s, manufacturing companies, and he said, use my ideas, the Deming 14 principles of management. Unfortunately for American manufacturers, they laughed at Dr. Deming in the 1950s and they said, why should we care about quality? Whatever we produce, the rest of the world is going to have to buy. There is no competition. There's no competition from Europe. There's no competition from Japan. If we produce defective products, the rest of the world will have to buy it. If we have defects, the American consumers will accept it. There is no competition. There is no choice. In the 1950s, we didn't have the major imports coming into the U.S. So Dr. Deming did not get accepted in the United States, so then he went to Japan. And Japan had a reputation back in the 1950s of poor quality. And even in the 1960s, Japan had a reputation of poor quality. I tell a joke to my students in my MBA classes that there was a city in Japan called USA, USA. And what a lot of factories would do and manufacturing companies in Japan is they would put their factories in that city, USA, Japan. And what they would do is when they made something, they would stamp on it, made in USA. Except they would not put capital U, lowercase sa, they would put capital case USA. And they would put all block letters, capital letters, saying made in USA. And what they were trying to do is to trick the buyers around the world that what was actually made in Japan with poor quality was actually made in the United States by putting made in USA. So Dr. Deming taught the Japanese, and as a result, they learned. And it took a generation of Japanese managers who were taught with the principles, and then they taught it to their subordinates, and several generations. And the idea of TQM is that it does not happen slowly. It takes several decades. It takes time. It takes effort. It takes commitment and dedication. It's continuous improvement. And Dr. Deming taught the Japanese. So by the 1980s, Japan had mastered TQM. So in the 1980s, American manufacturers and American managers, even service organizations, said, we need to implement TQM. So even if you run a bank, insurance company, a hotel, a restaurant, you try to implement TQM. Now, American manufacturers, they tried TQM. Unfortunately, it did not really work in America as well as it worked in Japan. There are several possible explanations. One explanation is that in Japan, you have a lot of trust between labor, unions, and management. In the United States, you did not have that same level of trust. There was distrust, there was a hostility between labor and management. Another explanation is that American managers are criticized as being too impatient. They wanted to see fast results. They wanted TQM to show results in 2 years, 3 years. Show me the results, show me the return on the investment. The Japanese managers were willing to wait 10 years, 15 years, even if it took 20 years to see the long-term benefits of TQM. Unfortunately for American manufacturers, American managers, they were not willing to wait even 5, 10 years. So many of the American manufacturers, they abandoned TQM. So going back to the timeline, now the question is, how do you compete globally? By the 1990s, we had become a global market. So the United States managers were faced with a dilemma and a problem. They could not compete on low wages because there were other countries where they would have lower wages, lower wage workers. They could not compete on quality because the Japanese still had better quality. German manufacturing had better quality than American manufacturing. So then the question was how to compete. By the 1990s, there was a movement towards regional cooperation, regional economic trading groups. Europe had moved towards the European Union, the European Community, in the mid-1980s, 1990s. So the United States said if Europe has their community, in Asia they were moving towards ASEAN, ASEAN, Association Southeast Asian Nations. So the United States said that Europe is moving towards an economic cooperative geographic group. Asia is moving towards an economic cooperative group. What are we doing in the United States? So the United States formed NAFTA, and NAFTA was the North American Free Trade Agreement. And the idea was to connect Mexico, Canada, and the United States into one main trading region and one main trading zone and partnership. Now, originally in the United States, the unions were opposed to NAFTA because they were afraid that the manufacturing jobs, American jobs, would go to Mexico because Mexico also had lower wages compared to American wages. As it's turned out, historically looking back over 10, 15 years, NAFTA seems to have been a good win-win solution. Mexico has benefited, the United States has benefited, Canada has benefited. And there's still some movements that need to be done in terms of synchronizing, harmonizing, reducing some of the barriers. For example, even today, there's a dispute because if you have truck drivers who are coming from Mexico and they want to cross the American border, there are still some regulations that restrict free flow. But the United States was moving towards more free trade with Canada and also with Mexico. Now, the European Union was also trying to form a cooperation, and their main view was to benefit Europe. And unfortunately for Americans, they were viewing it as also a restriction of free trade. What American Trade Commerce representatives said was that they called it Fortress Europe. Europe was going to become a fortress. It was going to become a closed market. There's not going to be an easy allowing of imports from the United States into Europe. And also Europe subsidized some of their companies, for example, with Airbus. Airbus manufactures commercial planes. And in the United States, you have Boeing. Boeing is a private sector company. They have to operate for profit, whereas Airbus received European government subsidies for several decades. So the United States faced a problem in competing in Europe, and just simply trading more with Canada, trading more with Mexico was not going to eliminate the trade deficit. So now we get to the modern time period, which is around the year 2000, and what we call the 2000s decade. So now the big concern in the United States is no longer Japan. Japan has gone through an economic stagnation. The Japanese population is getting older. There are some concerns about the support of the Japanese population and the youth and what that would do to their economy. So the United States is not really that concerned about Japan, but the big concern in the United States now, in the year 2009, 2010, is China and India. China, once again, the big concern the United States has is lower wages. With lower wages in manufacturing, most of the production which used to take place in Japan and then is shifted to South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, now most of that manufacturing has shifted to China. I was talking with one of our MBA students in the United States, and he was telling me the differential in terms of price. And to put it into a relative percentage perspective, what he was telling me was that if something was made in the United States, in the Midwest states, let's say near Detroit, Michigan, Illinois, it would cost $1 per unit manufacturing cost in the United States, in the Midwest. Now, that same unit cost of $1 US dollar in the United States, if they went to Mexico, the cost would be 40 cents. 40 cents compared to $1, 60% reduction in cost per unit. And then he said that these companies, they were originally going from the U.S. producing in Mexico. There was a program between the United States and Mexico called the Maquiladoras. And the Maquiladoras were border manufacturing plants between the United States and Mexico. So there was a big saving to go from the U.S., cross the border, manufacture in Mexico, have lower wages. But then the MBA student said, okay, if we go from Mexico to the Chinese manufacturing base, it's even lower in cost. And he said at the time it was 20 cents per unit manufacturing cost. So if you look at the cost, $1 per unit manufacturing cost in the United States and the Midwest, 40 cents to produce in Mexico, and 20 cents to produce in China. This is why most of the manufacturing in the entire world is now moving towards China. I recently have visited China a couple of times, and I went with my wife Yatri, and I've gone with some executive MBA students from Chapman University. And some individuals who have not visited China, they believe that China is going to peak out with capacity, that they could only manufacture so much, and at some point they're going to saturate their production capacity. The reality is that anyone who has visited China would know that there's still so much growth potential. Many of the Chinese factories are operating on one 8-hour shift. Some of the Chinese factories are operating in 2 8-hour shifts. But that still leaves 33% capacity increase potential. And the Chinese government is allocating additional growth possibility for new technology centers, new technology hubs, new innovation centers. And as a result, what would happen is that China is going to continue to be a major dominant concern for the United States. Now that leaves the last concern the United States has recently, which is India. And as everyone is aware, India is becoming the outsourcing capital of the entire world, and Bangalore in particular. And it started with lower type positions where you had teleconference centers, telemarketing centers, call centers, help desks. Those were lower wage type positions where basically individuals would answer questions, and the questions could be answered because obviously India has well-developed individuals with English-speaking capabilities. I remember the trend that occurred was that, also to show you an example of cost differential, if in the United States you hired someone to do telemarketing, at the time it would have cost perhaps $8 per hour. Now $8 per hour plus you're paying benefits and some additional overhead costs, so the actual cost would be $10, $11 per hour to do telemarketing in the United States, an American worker sitting in the United States. Then where the telemarketers started to move towards was Canada, and in particular Toronto. There were several Indians who had relocated to Toronto in Canada, and that's where telemarketers started moving their base. And they were able to offer lower wages to have the telemarketing done in Toronto. Then they realized, okay, with technology and voice over internet phoning and internet phones, why not just move everything to India? And the call centers could be here. And with a 13.5-hour differential between California and Bangalore, you could have call centers that are open in the evening, and individuals could have their questions answered in the United States. There are major companies who have set up their call centers here. Now, when originally these lower wage positions started leaving the United States, no one really raised a concern. You remember back in the 1970s, Congress said, we're going to keep IT jobs in the United States, we're going to keep IS jobs in the US. Don't worry about the imports, don't worry about manufacturing leaving the US because you're going to have technology jobs. No one really raised any concern about these telemarketing jobs leaving America. Why? Because they said, these are low-wage jobs, these are not attractive positions, we don't really care to lose these jobs. And as a result, everyone sort of ignored the trend. But then we started to see other types of higher paid positions leaving the United States, computer programming positions, Oracle type positions, Cisco, Microsoft positions, consulting positions in IT. This is where Americans started to wake up in around the year 2005, 2006, and they said, there may be a problem here in the future. And the problem in the future is that anything which could be put into a digital format, the jobs could be exported. So for example, with radiology, it's no longer required to have someone in the United States, a high-paid radiologist, sitting in the United States in a laboratory reading a chart. If you could have a digital image, an electronic file, that could be sent to India, and then the work could be done in India. We have examples of lawyers. There are lawyers in the United States I know who are often paid good wages, $300 per US, $300 US per hour. And what these lawyers have done is they've set up law libraries in India. And they have individuals who are lawyers, LLBs, LLMs, practicing advocates in India. And they set up the entire law library with United States codes, United States laws. And the legal research is done in India. There are major companies like Citibank, American Express, for good-paying MBA positions, financial analysts. If, for example, Citibank or American Express went to one of the top 20 MBA programs in the United States, they would be offering an annual salary of $100,000 per